Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome. And yeah, thanks for joining this webinar. And today's webinar was provided by Let's Face Change and in partnership with Middlesex University and Greater Manchester Mental Health. And as always, the focus of these webinars is to think about what mental health practitioners can do about racism. And as a collective, we try and sort of encourage conversations that are about exploring and tackling sort of the lack of diversity in clinical psychology and the racial inequalities in mental health services as a wider kind of thing. And these webinars really are an opportunity to just like keep these conversations going, explore new ideas, and kind of like build momentum to keep, these conversations in like different groups and connection, things like that. As always, some of our values, we really like to think about that, there's always a fear of getting things wrong, and we want this to be a space that does honor like difficult conversations and those feelings that arise from those conversations. And we do try and allow for different viewpoints. And with that, our values are around, the philosophy that there's no one right way to see the world or talk about some of the issues we'll be exploring today. So we really try and respect different perspectives. And so, yeah, we hope you enjoy the webinar today, and I'm just going to hand over to Rufus.
So yeah, I'm just here to briefly say hello and introduce Sugi Thiruchelvam, and who I met 10 years ago at a small gathering of people interested in talking with voices in Reading. And we started a peer supervision group after that, around that. But also I met Sugi recently in Copenhagen at the World Hearing Voices Congress, and her talk I've really found really interesting and moving. And I'm delighted that she's here to share a similar talk, maybe different, but similar. So I'm not going to say anything else. Just really glad you could join us all the way from Copenhagen, or is that right?
Nah, Denmark is right, but Western Funen though, long away from Copenhagen.
Right, yeah. So over to you.
Thank you. So I'm just going to share my screen. Let me see if I'm doing this right. Yeah, it's on full screen right now, right?
Yeah.
All right. So thank you for having me. As Rufus said, my name is Sugi, and I'm Tamil, but born and bred in Denmark. I'm a photojournalist, and I conduct workshops in personal storytelling as a tool for healing. And I'm here today to talk to you about the power of storytelling, the importance of language, as well as the importance of context. And to do that, I first need to tell you my story. Otherwise, kind of not make sense. This is my dad, and this is how I kind of remember him. He's still alive, but he always sits there right now because he recently retired. And yeah, that's his space. And the reason I'm showing you my dad is he's part of my history, right? My story begins long before I was born, because I am born to Tamil parents who lived in the Tamil homeland during the Sri Lankan genocide against the Tamil community, my community, right? While my dad left in haste after being targeted by the Sri Lankan state for being part of the Tamil resistance movement, my mom here, she was left behind with my two elder sisters, only to take on the voyage of escaping with them a few years later. Months after she started her escape, she ended up in Denmark, and my dad joined her here. I was born the same year to parents who didn't speak Danish, and let alone understood the new society and the culture they lived in. Since my dad already had two girls, he badly wanted a boy. But as you can see, I'm not a boy, and I still identify as she and her. I kind of imagine my dad watching me be born, being a tiny bit disappointed that I'm a girl, but not for so long. And then he decides that he's just going to raise me as a boy, even though I wasn't. So this is me being raised as a boy in a Tamil cultural home. So in my culture, it's customary to raise a child in a community. The saying, "it takes a village to raise a child," truly comes alive in my homeland. But in Denmark, my parents were told by the authorities that I needed to be put in daycare as soon as I turned 4 months old. From there to kindergarten, and then to preschool, and finally school, and to after-school activities. As a kid, I flourished in school. Tamils in Denmark were perceived as moral minorities. My teachers expected me to be an A-star student, so I became one. I excelled in academics, but I was also very creative. I had a vivid imagination, and I would draw, I played the violin, I attended dance school, and I even at some point wrote poetry. So I started in school in early 90s, and the following is the political context in Denmark back then. In the 90s, there was a systemic abuse of power in the government by denying Tamil families to reunite with each other. When this came to light, the Prime Minister of Denmark had to step down and the government was dissolved. This is what we today know as the Tamil Gate, or in a direct translation from Danish to English, the Tamil case. So this is part of my political context when starting in school as a Tamil kid. When I was in 4th grade, some of the immigrant laws changed in Denmark. Foreign kids were now supposed to attend classes with other immigrant kids, and not only to learn the language, but the broader subjects, mathematics, geography, everything was supposed to be for foreign kids only. Now imagine a 10-year-old kid in the prime age of shaping friendships, being taken out of her regular class to be put in a room with other kids whom she believed she had nothing in common with. Keep in mind that this was in the 90s, and Denmark had received more refugees from Palestine and Iraq and other war-torn countries. And the kids in this class obviously needed extra support in learning the language. But why was I, a kid born in Denmark, who was great in school, put there? So this is my social context of being in school in the 90s. At the end of that school year, the teachers realized that this was a mistake. And I went back to my real class, my regular class, the ones that I grew up with, but just realized that now I was alone. The friendships, the groups had been shaped, and I was the outsider. I was a foreign kid. This feeling of being an outsider continues till this day. And there's a huge population of Tamils in the UK, so I'm guessing that some of you, or even most of you, have come in contact with some of them at some point in life. If any of them were women, there's a big chance, huge chance, that they had long black hair. But this is me, not so long hair. I was actually bald at some point, just a few months before this picture was taken, actually. But I'm in my Tamil clothes. I had shaved my head, and I don't know if you guessed, but this look didn't exactly make me fit in my homeland either. So I feel like an outsider when I'm home. And when I say home, I mean Denmark. But I also feel like an outsider when I'm in my homeland. Anyways, back to my story, and let me fast forward a bit. I first met the established psychiatry in Denmark in my teenage years. My second time was in my early 20s, and very quickly I got a diagnosis and I was heavily medicated. the context that I was talking about earlier didn't seem to matter to the doctors or the therapists. For them, it was criteria, symptoms, checkboxes, and medications. In their eyes, I was a sick person. In my papers, it says, Sugi is a college dropout, and this is true. I did take a lot of breaks in my studies, but I did eventually end up getting my degree. And they continue in the note saying that I was been on sick leave for years. And they write that the medicine that I was prescribed seemed to be working. At the same time, I thought that I could go back to university and actually finish my studies. But according to the doctors, early retirement would be a better fit. And they continue to write in the notes that when they discussed the subject with me, the subject of going back to school, the doctors noted that she seemed delusional and outraged by the suggestion. And they end the note with saying, Sugi is likely to be medicated for the rest of her life. And I didn't agree to that. I never agreed to be medicated in the first point, actually. And here's the thing. So how many of you have either dropped out or of your studies or changed midway? The issue is ordinary things become problematic if you are defined by a mental diagnosis in the system. And furthermore, the system is not questioned if the system becomes problematic for humans. When I look in my papers from my therapists and the doctors, I see a very linear story. I fulfill these criteria, and that leads to this diagnosis. But taking into account all the different contexts, the systems, and structural arenas of my life, it gets a bit more complex than just symptoms and diagnosis. Epigenetically, I am carrying the traumas of my parents and my ancestors. My bodily reactions came out of mental suffering, and my mental suffering came from societal circumstances, and these circumstances were created by political laws. When I was medicated, I had no authority over my body or my soul or my mind. At some point, I didn't really know who I was or what I could become. Slowly, my genes were taken away, the medication numbed me, and I lost everything that I deep inside me knew was me. My possibilities were narrowed, and my future had to fit in the box that society had created for me. This is how I see that Western psychiatry understands us. Do you have these symptoms? Yes or no? If yes, you fit in this box. If no, let's see which box you fit in. A leads to B. It's linear, and it's a very simplified list of criteria that tells you of the complexity of your life, of you. And here's what I like to call it: oppression. This oppression is the systemic suppression of emotional discharge and the invalidation of people in vulnerable situations. It's the attempt to control people by enforcing standards of conduct and thereby invalidating their process, categorizing people into diagnoses, and finally pressuring people to do something about it. As if what happened to you is your own responsibility to fix and not as a result of society. My story is exactly that. It's a result of the things that happened to me and of how I personally experienced them. And here's the thing: the systems and the institutions of the society might have authority, but you have the power to shape and create your own story. I believe that we are the sum of not only the stories that we tell ourselves, but also the stories we have been told about ourselves. These stories are and will be in the context of the society that we live in, the political and the structural systems, and most importantly, how we personally experience them. And as we go along telling our stories, we kind of pick and choose. We create what is known as our dominant narrative. And these narratives will influence our everyday lives, our relationships, and how we perceive ourselves and interact in the world around us. We are products of our past experiences and conditioning, but we are also products of what comes later. And we have the power to choose what comes next. And every single time we actively choose something for our lives, we alter the narrative and thus the product that we are. And this kind of leads to my second half of my presentation, because how can we use storytelling to reclaim our stories? Storytelling is the art of conveying narratives through words, visuals, experiences to engage, inform, or even entertain an audience. A good story engages people. A great story creates empathy and human bonding. When used in therapy, we use empathy and self-compassion towards ourselves to make our stories great. It's a powerful and timeless practice that captures human emotions and experiences and ideas. Thus, it enables us to connect with others, convey messages effectively, and inspire action. Whether through spoken words, written stories, visual presentations, or immersive experiences, storytelling plays a pivotal role in human communication and expression. In all forms of storytelling, we use language. In exchange, the language creates our reality. The reality determines how we see ourselves and interact in the world around us. When we use storytelling as a tool towards healing, we stop looking for the source of the problem. Instead, we engage in the self and the beautiful, complex creatures that we are. And this is contrary to the established Western psychiatry, which looks for all the weaknesses to help put us in a box. Storytelling, on the other hand, opens the path to discover our strength and values. Now, try to imagine your life as a book, and you are the author. Examine what's important in the story. How do you want to present the protagonist? Which experiences will give the reader a sense of who the protagonist is and what values they carry? When we are in distress, when our life seems to be filled with darkness, it can feel impossible to recognize or even navigate your own mind and have a sense of agency. When we are in distress, we can be convinced by the stories others and authority figures tell us about ourselves. We tend to lean toward our dominant narrative, which puts us in a default position as the sick one. Our stories become centered around this one single element and that element only. We fail to see ourselves as anything but the sick one. and others fail to see our shared humanity. In this position, it's hard to find our sense of agency. It's probably not obvious, and it's definitely not immediate, but trust me, it's there. When we start to examine our life stories as an author, we can start to question and critique the narratives, both the ones we were told about ourselves, but especially the ones that we tell ourselves. By examining your story, you give yourself permission to choose which experiences that you want to include in your dominant narrative. This doesn't mean that what you leave out is forgotten or safeguarded as a secret. It just means that you narrate your story the way that you want to narrate it. When I started conducting workshops in reclaiming your narrative, I first had to explore and examine my own story. This resulted in the book In the Shadows of the War. Even though I have never experienced war on a personal level, I became aware that I was a product, or that I was also a product of the fact that my parents and my ancestors and grandparents had experienced it. In the first chapter of my book, I wrote this. When my parents were forced to seek refuge in a foreign country, they did not realize that they gave me the freedom and the burden of breaking generational cycles. While packing their bags with hope, heading for safety for my siblings and the unborn me, they also packed generational traumas inherited from their ancestors. It's on me to break these cycles, and I do not have a roadmap. When interviewing my parents for my book, I realized that due to language troubles, my siblings and I became the adults in the house. We would translate at the doctors and sit in counselor meetings translating stuff which was not really for children's ears. This shifted the balance in my relationship with my parents, and the fact that my parents had to reinvent our upbringing in a whole different context than the one they knew also influenced my story. I had choices my parents didn't have. I had the freedom my parents didn't have. All this and so much more goes into account when telling my story, and I'm still exploring and examining everything of it. In one of the last pages, I had written this. I belong in both and neither. They want me to be like them, them being different. I'm never enough of either. This is me, and this is my narrative. Working with your whole self and complex life stories can be exhausting. Some of the tools that I use in my workshop are timelines. I do this to include as much context as possible. And this is very contrary to Western psychiatry's understanding of diagnosis and symptoms. So before I get to the tools like timelines, I want to show you what I mean when I say that Western psychiatry does not include context. And I'm going to give you a few examples. I know there's a lot of text. It's citations, quotes directly from World Health Organizations. So we all probably know someone who has anxiety or depression. And here's WHO's description of anxiety in the ICD-11 diagnosis system. So generalized anxiety disorder is characterized by marked symptoms of anxiety that persist for at least several months, for more days than not, manifested by either general apprehension or excessive worry focused on multiple everyday events, most often concerning family, health, finances, and so forth. This description explains symptoms, and it doesn't include context or even just life. It's as if the symptom just decided to pop up one day and say, hey, here am I. So let's look at the depression. It's kind of the same. Depressive disorders are characterized by depressive mood or loss of pleasure, accompanied by other cognitive, behavioral, or neurovegetative symptoms that significantly affect the individual's ability to function. And it's the same again, no context. So one of the only diagnoses that I found in the ICD-11 system, which accounts for context, is stress disorders, and specifically PTSD and complex PTSD. If you look at the description, the ICD-11 formulation of PTSD requires an exposure to trauma defined as an extremely threatening or horrific event or series of events. So here you have context, but it's very rare that you see this types of definition in other mental diagnoses. But something is happening in the field of therapy, specifically for minority communities. In a recent study by Professor Iram Kavaya, she coined two words, minority and stress. She writes, minoritized and racialized subjects' daily challenges of dealing with microaggressions, stigmatization, and discrimination. That's minority stress. Stress often is understood in individualized terms, and a focus on discrimination and othering rarely addresses the negative psychological and affective consequences of these processes. Minority stress represents a focus on structural and societal conditions and discourses that positions racialized specific subjects as others. The experience of being stigmatized and othered and racialized is connected to a constant form of stress and hypervigilance, which needs to be understood in its own right. And structural and societal processes taking social inequality, discrimination, and racism must be taken into account. Her definition connects all the dots. And with that, let me show you a few tools that can be used to include context in the process of healing. So I use a lot of timelines, as I mentioned earlier. I make multiple timelines to help put things in order. One timeline can be personal experiences. Another one can be things that happen simultaneously in society. Another one can be the political context. The more timelines explored, the more context revealed. What Western psychiatry deems as symptoms may just be a natural response to life. Maybe it's a very normal response to a very abnormal situation. I also use the tree of life. This is a very effective tool to dig through one's past and ancestral history, one's roots. Where do I come from? And the 6-part story method puts one's relations into characters and roles. Questions like, who helped me? Who was my support system? Who or what was my enemy? And finally, I am a photojournalist, so I use thinking in pictures. Gathering it all in thinking in pictures allows us to revisit memories that might not have been given proper credit, which may actually have been critically defining moments of our lives. And thinking in pictures, digging through your phones, if we are that generation, or old albums, will help us talk about memories that we might have put in a little box really back in our head, but can be very defining. In telling my story, I used different tools, and I used all of them to reclaim my narrative. I realized that I couldn't be me without my whole family and ancestors' histories. And this might be a different approach to things, but I realized that I wasn't unique. While details and experiences might be unique to me, I have a shared history with many others of different paths, of which are ultimately entwined. And talking about being unique or not being unique, psychologists would argue that our uniqueness, the things that set us apart from others, is key to understand our sense of identity. But this uniqueness is also quite often linked to isolation. In my opinion, belonging to communities makes us more aware of our identity, and thus is a vital part of healing and breaking the isolation. The more we engage in and examine the past, in our roots, in our context, in the structures that form society, the more we will see how much we have in common. Let me give you an example of this. I have a group of friends, a group of Muslim friends, who have had a hard time engaging in our shared experiences. Experiences like racism, microaggressions, and so forth. In separating these things, they couldn't mirror themselves in others and thus find solace and healing. So I found this. This is an ancient language called Avi. It's Tamil and Arabic combined. And voila, there was the door to explore what we have in our shared ancestor past, leading to shared experiences today. The things we have in common might not be related, but it's an opening to sharing and to healing. And all of this isn't new. I didn't create all of this. Storytelling, community healing, and collective memories are ancient. During colonial time, the British enslaved Tamils from India and transported them by ships to work in the tea plantations in the mountains in Sri Lanka. Many amongst them died on the way. The survivors couldn't show rage or even grief without being punished by the colonial masters. So they started to sing their stories. They sang their sorrow, whispering names of the dead in the songs. When one group started singing, another one would join in. And storytelling is collective healing. The process of reclaiming our story will hurt, and it will lead us to reauthor our narrative. If we wait for repair from the people or even the institutions of society who rupture something within us, we are giving away the power. And we don't need their permission to heal. We deserve to tell our stories. Life stories are never complete. They are ongoing, and they are really messy. They are certainly not perfect. And through acceptance of our own stories, we allow ourselves to grow beyond them. And with this, thank you for having me here today. Oh, wow.
So much, Sugi, for sharing those powerful images alongside your powerful words. Yeah,
Thank
really
you.
appreciate that. What we'll do is we'll go to the Q&A chat and we'll see some of the questions that are coming up. So if people want to put their questions into the Q&A, that would be wonderful. And then I can ask, and Uzi can ask Sugi some of those questions.
Yeah.
Great. There is a practical question. So I know we're recording this and this will go on the website, but Chris was very moved by some of the quotes that we used, found them very powerful, and wondered if it was possible to have a copy of the slides as well. So I don't know if that would be okay with you to.
That's okay. Yeah, I'll share it with the group so you can send it.
That's lovely. Thank you. That's really generous of you. So we've got a question that's coming from Anne, who's asking, is it different to explore your own story in Tamil and Danish?
Yeah, it's really different. So language and words, the way we describe it, it's very differently loaded. I'm not sure if this example is correct. I don't remember if my memory is doing me right, but there was a study when they gave certain words to different ethnicities and asked them to put them in a description, whether it was feminine or masculine. So the word bridge, I think it was Germans, Dutch people who described it as this strong, steel, manly thing, and Spanish people was like, oh, so curvy and so living and moving, very feminine thing, right? So the weight of the language is so important. But I also mix up things, right? Because I remember things in both languages. It sometimes gets mixed up to kind of, yeah, to a point where I get confused myself.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it really makes that difference. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Thank you. There's another question here as well from Giselle about when people are trying to reclaim their stories, if you've got any ideas about the kind of support that needs to be in place so that people end up not feeling disempowered through that process.
Yeah. So there's actually, I think it's a telling a story needs an audience, and you really need to pick who you're telling it to, right? So it has to be a person or group of people that you feel safe with, and also open about exploring where you're coming from. So it's like, I wouldn't go around talking about my own personal story with anyone in a very personal setting if I didn't have trust in them, right? So you kind of need to find that community, and there's a lot of legwork in that. You know, you don't open the door and find someone. You have to put a lot of yourself into creating that community before you reclaim your story.
Yeah. Okay. So a lot of work and trust being absolutely fundamental in there.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like finding a therapist, right? Like you need to have that chemistry and you need to have that trust to talk openly about the stuff that you're carrying on your shoulders. So community is vital to reclaiming your story.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I'm sorry, go on, Izzy.
Just sort of looking at some of the comments in the chat function and sort of noticing the word that's coming out to me is powerful and moving in terms of your narrative. Really resonate with that. It was also similar for me, quite striking and moving as well in terms of your story. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
I think, have we got more questions?
Can I ask?
Yeah.
If you really want.
Yeah. So you've written a book, Sugi, In the Shadow of the War.
Yeah.
And you interviewed your parents
Yeah.
for that. So how was that process?
The process was heavy. One of the days, I actually realized by the end of the day that I had been sitting in a kind of interviewing setting with my parents for 8 hours straight. Like not straight, but we had lunch, but still just during lunch and after lunch, just continuing being kind of a journalist interviewing people, right? But I was part of the conversation. And it was heavy because I don't think I have ever had so deep conversation with my parents before. And it has to be said that it was in a context of, I had another conflict with my parents a few years earlier. And this was right about COVID, making the lockdown. So I was actually not in touch with my parents for almost 2 years, even though they lived like 40 minutes away from here. But the COVID and the conflict kind of just made things isolating. And that's when I started the process of writing my book. And so I met my parents after these years in a position of being a journalist, as well as their daughter, trying to kind of figure out where they come from and how that had put me, or not put me, but how that had shaped me, right? And even though it was very, the thing about translating at the doctors, it's not unique for me. A lot of diaspora kids do that, even still today, they do that, right? And it kind of was always said in a funny way. It was like used as humor that we used to translate at the doctors. But that setting of interviewing my parents, it gave depth to that sentence, you know, like sitting at a doctor's, talking about your parents' illness as 6, 7, 10-year-old kid, it's not funny. And I always looked at it from my perspective, right? Like I was a child, why should I do that? And I didn't even do that a lot. My elder siblings did that way more than I did. But I really didn't see it from their perspective of what it made, how it made them feel, right? Like they lost the power of being parents because now they were dependent on their kids and not vice versa. So the process was really heavy, and I had to take it over so many weeks, going back and exploring different subjects and a lot of, I don't know if it's common for another refugee groups, but Tamil parents don't really talk about the voyage, the fleeing the country. And it just struck me that my mom had 2 kids under the age of 2, fleeing to directly to the other part of the world, right? Like half across the world. And I'm not even sure that my mom was like, I'm pretty sure she wasn't fluent in English, and she had never been outside of her homeland. And now she was doing this with 2 kids, right? So I got to explore a lot of their stories, and it made so much sense why I became the way I became. Yeah, that was a long answer to a short question.
Yeah. Well, I can ask more if there are. If we please don't worry.
We have
We do
more
have
questions.
Step
Just
back.
hearing that, thinking what a sort of wonderful woman your mum is, the sort of power and
Yeah.
sort of the influence she's had in your life is incredible.
Yeah, and it was a tipping point interviewing her, because I think this is very universal, right? That you see yourself, you see your mom as mom, first and foremost mom, before you see her as a woman. But at the interviewing stages, I saw my mom as this really strong, independent woman who did what she thought was best for her children, right? But and at that point, and since that, I really actively think about trying to see her as a woman of her own entity and not just my mom. Like I would not pressure her to do something that I think is fit for a mom to do, right? Like I'll ask her, like, so how do you feel about it being a woman? You know, and I have never done that before, even though I'm 38 today, right? And I wrote it back in 2020, so it's just 5 years ago. I never asked my mom questions about being a woman, and suddenly I was there asking all these different things and seeing her in a very, very different light.
Can I ask a
That
follow-up?
leads us.
Oh,
Sorry,
sorry.
go on.
Just on this topic, just really interesting. So do you think that kind of interviewing your mum like played a part in her reclaiming her narrative? And then I'm also wondering do you think it had kind of any impact on any kind of healing between you guys, or kind of was the process healing in any?
So I actually don't know if my mom reclaimed anything, but I think she claimed. I think she claimed that, oh yeah, so I did that back in the 80s. I left my country with 2 kids, you know, and I don't think she had given that part of her life any credit, because I think it was put in a box that I must do this. You know, you don't revisit the path to where you are right now. And to the second part of the question about if it healed something between us, I couldn't put into words how much it healed us. The understanding, because we had to like overcome the first, I don't know how to put it in English, but we had to tear down the first wall of communication, because when I started to telling them about what I was doing and I'm exploring my story, blah, 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 they were like, we did so much for you. Like, you don't have a hard life. Like, look at ours. And it's a very classic refugee parents thing, that we did all this so you could have a better life. And now you're looking like you were harmed in the process, kind of. I was like, no, that's not what I'm doing. I'm just like trying to like figure out who I am, and you are a part of that process. So tearing down that first wall really opened a lot to heal. Because they saw where I was coming from, what I was trying to do. They understood that the first page that I wrote, that they didn't just give me the freedom to choose the life that I wanted. They also gave me the burden, because I was choosing things that they might not approve, but that's exactly what they gave me by giving me the freedom to choose, right? So for them to understand where I was coming from and vice versa really healed a lot. And we communicate in a very different way today. Like, it might be a Tamil parents daughters thing, but I see it in my Muslim friends as well, that parents tend to look at children as children always. Like, you don't grow up, kind of, right? I remember my mom saying to my sister's 40th birthday, oh, now you're an adult. And I was like, what the fuck, mom? Like, she's been an adult for like 22 years, right? But yeah, it healed a lot, and it has given us a different connection, not just as parents and daughter, but as shared history, like the ancestral history. It really healed a lot. I should try to keep the answer short.
No, please don't.
Is it okay to stop the screen share, Sugi?
Oh yeah.
We can see you more.
Oh yeah. So, sorry.
That's great.
Do you know, Sugi, I think you're inspiring a lot of other people to try and explore their narratives more. That's kind of popping up in the chat and in the Q&A as well.
Thank you.
And there's a question connected to that around any other advice you'd have around kind of scaffolding questions that you might ask family members? So someone's actually asked if you have an interview schedule that you might use to ask people.
I did have for my own book, I created that, but I'm also a trained journalist, so it kind of comes really naturally. But I always do, I don't know if it's the same word in English, but is it a synopsis? It's the same thing in English?
Yeah.
Yes, so I do a synopsis of what subjects that I want to explore. And then I both go along with the questions and the answers, but I really also frame it, because helping others reclaim their narrative is really about letting them talk. I just put in the questions now and then and see where it kind of leads. But I have a framework to do it.
I wondered if some of the ideas that you hold quite dear to your story, Sugi, are similar to narrative therapy, or are there different ideas that you have?
Yes and no, kind of. I recently came across another professor in psychology. She was doing a presentation before me for a psychiatry department in Denmark. And a lot of her research is kind of where I get my ideas from. But the narrative therapy is set in a therapist and a client room, right? Like a framework. And I don't see myself as a therapist. I am not a therapist. I'm a journalist, and which I think is very liberating, because I'm not conformed to using terms in psychology or anything. I can just sit there with the person and explore their narratives. I help them explore it. So I take some from that, but my workshop is very product oriented, because they actually end up doing a book themselves. It's like it's not an art book and it's not a written book. It's like what they make it to be. Some people, they find old pictures and old papers and scan them and put it in the books. But the whole process of the workshop is actually reclaiming it in a very productly way. So you end up with a book that's saying, okay, so now this is my narrative. And I find that doing that process and having a product kind of helps people to reclaim it over and over and over again. It's like, if you think about doing something, it's way more strong to actually write it down and saying, I'm going to do it, right? If you just think about it, just reclaim your narrative in your head, and it's like, okay, this is me now. You can walk for 10 steps and forget it. But if you have a book, you can always revisit it and you can always reclaim it again. But it's not set in stones. It's always to be analyzed and find different meanings of what you have put in the book, right? So yeah, I hope it answered the question.
Yeah, thank you for your response. Really well worded. Appreciate that response. The question in the chat, we can maybe go to that.
Yeah.
Sort of around. Oh, do you want to take it, Jen?
No, go on, you go.
Sort of any sort of ideas that you might have in terms of how we as professionals or people on the webinar can use storytelling to challenge systems, especially for those who are in vulnerable, isolated, difficult places, I suppose.
I would say the first thing to do as a therapist might be to not use psychological terms, And I know there's a very clear boundary between being a therapist and a client, and there's a special setting in that frame and in that room, but not becoming friends. But you can still have a conversation, just being really curious about the person sitting in front of you and giving them autonomy to take it where they need to take it, So first thing would be to not use terms. And the second thing would be to really be curious about who they are. And a very specific question would be, what happened? just what happened. And a lot of therapists fail to kind of ask that, because you go in, you have a diagnosis, and then you start to talk about the symptoms. You have anxiety, and you talk about how it feels and how you cope with it. And even cope is a psychological term, right? Like, you don't ask how do you deal with it. But if you explore the person in front of you, you might be able to help them find the reason for your anxiety, right? So be curious.
It's a really strong message, really powerful message. Just to be curious about someone's story. Use their own words, use their words rather than terminology we might bring in the setting.
Mirror them.
I remember, Sugi, from your previous talk, I think you talked about this must be very common for second generation people who've, come to another country from terror or from war, and that your parents had a real sense of they had suffered and you wouldn't know what suffering was like.
Yeah.
What was that? Did you kind of, was that in your narrative really, that you had to sort of reclaim, or because you had it? Yeah, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, so I explained earlier about when you reclaim your narrative that you need an audience that you trust.
Yeah.
And I had to really work a lot in trusting my parents to understand where I come from. And being in that position also meant that having to explain to them that it's a language question, it's an and question. Their suffering doesn't mean that I didn't suffer, right? It's just different sufferings, or like different hardships, or whatever word you wanted to use. I spoke to them in Tamil, so I don't know how to directly translate it, but it's about two things being true at the same time. It's an and, like you suffered and I suffered, it's a language. It's not like you suffered, but I suffered. Like you suffered, I suffered. It's an and question. It's like, yeah. So they understand it eventually that their context led to their suffering, and that led to a different context for me, which led to different sufferings, to be using that word suffering, right? But I think I made a decent job in kind of explaining to them that I wasn't saying that they didn't suffer or that I suffered more or anything. It was directly a and sentence. You suffered and I suffered.
Your work reminds me of the Hearing Voices movement, because one of the founders was a journalist, Sandra Escher.
Oh.
Had a journalist background.
Oh.
It's what she brought. She was like the fairy godmother of the Hearing Voices movement.
Yeah, yeah.
And you have Marius Rom, who's the psychiatrist, and she was the researcher, but she very much wanted people to tell their stories. And
it very much makes sense now because of the Maastricht interview. It's an interview.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's all about what's happened to you. Tell us.
Yeah. And how do you connect the dots? It really makes sense, and I didn't know that. Thank you for enlightening me.
There's a nice loop.
Yeah.
In the circle. Yeah, that we need to be curious like a journalist and just be open, and makes me want to train in journalism.
Yeah, come join me.
Do you do courses?
Not in journalism though.
In storytelling. That's good.
In storytelling, in personal storytelling. Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of people come to your workshops?
So it might not sound fair, but I don't take attendees who are heavily medicated. And the reason for doing that is because when you are heavily medicated, specifically for antipsychotic medicine, it's very hard to dig deep. It's very hard to find the sense of agency and your own mind. So the most people that I get, that I have as attendees in my workshops are people who have been on medication, but it's kind of in between and moving on from one to another, and who, most of them have been in therapy, in some sorts. Most of them have been medicated, but they are at a shifting point. They're like, either they don't want to have medication anymore, or they don't really identify with the diagnosis that they have had. So all of them, I could say, they have some sort of a psychiatric diagnosis in one way or the other, but none who are heavily medicated. Mm-hmm.
Another question that's popped up in the chat, which is asking about if you have views around different trials in the NHS of approaches such as open dialogue.
Can you repeat that? I didn't hear it clearly.
Yeah, sorry. So just asking about your views on trialing approaches that might have similar values around sort of reducing hierarchy, focusing on multiple perspectives. So approaches like open dialogue that are being trialed in the NHS, if you have views and ideas about that.
I have tried open dialogue myself, and I think it's a very good tool, actually. I think even the open dialogue thing kind of have a setting. So in that case, it's a little bit limiting, I think it's the word. But in the sense, I think it's a very good tool, because open dialogue is what it exactly is open dialogue, right? And getting groups in, you know, like the safety nets and engaging with the community that you have in your everyday life is so important. Like, why would I reclaim my narrative if I didn't have anyone to share it with? Isolation is a very real problem, especially in the Western sphere of the world. So yeah, I think it's a good thing, open dialogue. And in some way, I also think the Maastricht interview from the Hearing Voice movement is a very good tool. And now it all makes sense after I realized, like Rufus told me, that Sandra was a journalist as well. Because you to some extent, you need a frame to kind of structure the process. But the key is to allow the attendee or the client, or whatever term you want to use, to feel like they are in charge of that process. You know, giving them the tools to figure out for themselves without limiting what it is.
Yeah, so facilitating the stories to come up as they come up, but within that framework or a framework. Yeah. And there's a question as well about how professionals can use the stories that might emerge to make change in the systems.
Yeah. So the one thing that I have trouble accepting is how we in the Western sphere define research, or how we kind of blindly and solely trust in a specific type of academic research. So I have sources that are from Western research, like university research, PhDs and stuff. But my inspiration is really ancient. The storytelling and how it has been used in indigenous communities and in ancestral histories, and how history survives in those contexts. I have trouble only accepting Western research as a source of discipline or tool, right? So how therapists and professionals in the system could use that is by allowing people to come with their own baggage and not try to put them in like, okay, you fit in this box, right? So take the face value, like food, you know, it survived for centuries, like the recipes and stuff, and it's still healthy. And nobody like 200 or 1,000 years ago had Western research to kind of come up with recipes that were healthy or what to use, not to use, right? So trust in history and ancestral practices, you know, be open to it.
Mm-hmm. There's a specific question that might connect a little bit to that, and I'm sorry I might have pronounced this name wrong, but someone's asking if you know a Canadian educator called, I think it's Gabor Mate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not
Yeah,
sure if I said that right,
the trauma specialist.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think his approach is very interesting. And speaking of Gabor Mate, I think I don't even know how to say it. I just read it, right? The word trauma, I think in today's world we are kind of misusing it a lot. Like we just throw it out there, you know, like from being a very specific professional psychological term, it has become an everyday use, right? Like everybody goes on like, oh, it was so traumatic that I was there or whatever, right? So in that sense, I think Gabor is spot on in describing what trauma is. I think he says something like, it's not what happened to you, but it's what happens inside you. Like, you know, and I think that's a real thing, because you can put 10 people through the same experience and they would come with 10 different experiences, right? Like they would have a very personal analysis of what happened. So trauma is really what happened inside you and not what happened, right? How did you experience it?
Yeah, and that so ties back into your point about allowing people to tell their own stories, but also finding shared histories as well. But they're still
exactly, yeah. Yeah, because I think being so I don't know if I'm gonna use this word. How do you say it? So the challenge, not the problem. The challenge of being unique in a mental health context is that you don't only become unique in your diagnosis or in your situation, but because of the uniqueness that you feel, you tell yourself that nobody has been through this before, so nobody can help me. Nobody knows what I'm going through, right? So you don't mirror yourself. You don't see all the things that you share with so many other people. And that's problematic, because your personal experience of what happened is unique, but the experience itself, it's likely that it's shared with so many other people. And we kind of need to find that to find community. You know, who do I have something in common with?
that really ties in with the last comment on the chat about peer support.
Oh, can you speak a bit louder, Jen?
I keep moving. I think I'm putting my hand over my mic. Yeah, that ties in with the last comment on the chat about peer support being so important. But yeah, but I think I saw Rufus talking as well, but still muted, so I'll mute myself.
I was just saying, there's a couple of comments in the chat that you might want to respond to or just hear.
Yeah.
Chris said, thanks, Sugi, that was great. As a queer person, I've minimized and normalized some of my own experiences of distress. And it was really powerful to hear you speaking about reauthoring stories in the context of political and societal landscape.
Thank you. So, thank you for the wonderful words.
And I saw another comment from Giselle, talking about maybe reflecting on the conversation you had with your mother. I'm just going to try and find it. Where is it? Is there any way you can see it?
I'm gonna see if I can find it.
There's loads of quotes, actually. There's loads of comments. No, but it's the comments, not the questions. Yeah, but I think she was talking about the sort of mums don't show their anxieties because they try to normalize things for their children. So it must have taken a lot of energy. I wonder if she means for you or for your mum.
Yeah. I if there is a question there, I would say it took a lot of energy for both of us. And I think one of the things that made my mom being a woman and not just mom was actually that she became vulnerable in the conversations. You know, she wasn't not pretending, but she wasn't stepping into the role of being the strong mom. She was stepping into being this woman who fled her own country to safeguard her children. So yeah, it took a lot of energy for both of us, and I don't know, but I have a sense that even for my dad, it took more energy to be vulnerable because, you know, stereotypically as a Tamil man, you know, the powerful dad and everything. So for him to be vulnerable and telling me that he felt the loss of being a father when he became dependent on his children and not the other way around. I haven't seen my dad so vulnerable anytime before or later. You know, that was a very defining moment for me to see, like, oh yeah, there was something. Like I kept looking at it from my side of the table, but he had a whole different experience, and I ended up on the way back crying and crying because this was 5 years ago, right? And he was in Denmark since 86, so he must have carried that for so many years and never put into words. And it really touched me, and I think it healed something between us because now I understood where he was coming from, you know.
Building that compassion with your family, as it also, or had you already done that work, but built more compassion for you and parts of you, different parts?
Yes. I think for doing any therapeutical work, the first person that you need to show compassion to is towards yourself. Yeah. You know, you really need to be good to yourself, no matter what comes at you. You can end up being like, I should have done better, or I should have seen that coming, or, you know, like, yeah, I struggle to find the English term for it, but in Danish, we kind of say like knocking yourself on the head on the way out. You can't really do that. You really need to have self-compassion through the whole process, and in general, no matter where you stand in life, self-compassion is so important. So I couldn't do the interviews if I wasn't aware that I might be attacked by my parents, you know, for doing this project, for looking at my own story and not theirs, and be feeling sorry for myself or whatever. I really needed to tell myself that I'm being true to myself, and this is my story, and my story doesn't neglect theirs. And they're coming from a different point in life. They're coming from a different context and everything. But I really needed to have so much compassion in the beginning of the process, because just telling your parents, like diaspora parents, that, oh yeah, I'm writing a book about myself, you know, kind of feels really egoistic. But I find that my book has helped so many other diaspora kids, adult kids, refugee kids being adults, to mirror a lot of experiences, even though they are not ethnically Tamil.
We've got mention of another book in the Q&A, which is a book which I haven't read. It's called Women Who Run with Wolves, and there's a query about whether you've read that or not, and a recommendation that the person Yeah.
I haven't read it, but I think I have seen the title before.
Yeah.
Yeah, Woman Who Ran with Wolves. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I have the title somewhere in the back of my mind.
Annie, did you have a question?
No, I didn't, Rufus.
Just know that you're really interested in this subject. What's
Yeah,
it like for you? I'll ask you a question. What's it like for you hearing Sugi?
no, it's really interesting. So I'm a trainee clinical psychologist and I'm doing a research project on kind of like the experiences of people who've like racialized people who've gone to therapy for like for racial trauma, see what that's like. I think your talk is really like inspiring me about how to do that and like what that process might be like and like different ways to think about like interviewing people or actually like how to structure the research. I think.
Nice. Have you read the book called Decolonized Therapy or Decolonizing Therapy?
No, I haven't. No.
I remember, I don't remember her last name, but it's maybe Jennifer Mullen. She has a PhD in the States somewhere in Georgia, I think. I think her book is called Decolonizing Therapy, and it's very powerful. I find so much inspiration in her work.
Great. Thank you. I'll have a look at it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And Renée Edo-Lodge from the UK, right? She wrote a powerful book as well. Why, I think it's called something like Why I Don't Talk About Race with White People or something.
Oh yeah, I've read that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's quite powerful as well.
Just pop up in the chat. Again, appreciate what you've shared about healing in community, connecting past and recognizing the impacts of histories, and wondering if you have any more.
Can't hear you so well, Jen.
Oh, sorry, am I doing it again? Sorry. I'll go straight to the question. Do you have any advice for how we could build community in our fractured and polarized, more westernized world?
Wow, that's heavy and that's loaded.
Big question.
Big question, yeah. If I have advice for building community, I don't know really, because I kind of struggle myself in that, and I do have some principles though. I think you need to have different types of community. So I have a community with, I hate this word, but I'm struggling to find the English word for it, but with intellectual minds, like where we share philosophies, and we live really across the world. Most of our chats is in groups and Signal and WhatsApp, but I have that community there, right? And I also have, I insist on having a geographical community. So specifically where I'm living, which is in Western Funen, and for those of you who doesn't know Denmark, we have the long part connected to Germany, and there's an island in the middle, and then we have the big island where Copenhagen is placed, right? So I live on the western part of the middle island, and it's very, very countryside. I'm the one and only foreign people per person in the community, and I'm also the youngest. I think the next person would be maybe in the 50s, you know, and I'm 38. So, but I insist on having a geographical community because it's important to walk out the door, and if you need a cup of coffee with someone to just vent, that you have that possibility. You know, I grew up with 4 siblings. We were 5 girls, and I had that community, but eventually we grew up and we moved to different parts of Denmark. So now we see each other for birthdays and weddings, maybe, yeah, weddings as well, and all that stuff. But I don't really have the possibility to walk out of the door and have a coffee with my sister. I need to plan it. I need to drive. I need to see if she has time, you know? So it's really important to have a geographical community. I think one of the problems is it's connected to the isolation thing, that the more we become isolated, the more responsibilities we give to one person or one community. You know, like we expect the one person close to us to fulfill a lot of different roles that maybe just 50 and 100 years ago was divided in community in different people. If you wanted a hug, you would go to this person. If you wanted a meal, you would go to this person. If you wanted to vent, you would go to this person, right? But now we kind of expect that the one person, and usually the partner, you know, to fulfill the whole damn thing, and it's just not possible, you know. So have different communities. Yeah, different communities is important. Yeah, did I answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely gave me lots of food for thought, thinking about my own life and thinking about the work that I do, which is often with families arriving in the UK who are homeless, and the huge important need to help community build as one of the primary things to do.
Yeah. Community is so important.
Your community in the US, Sugi.
Oh, hi. Hi, Kayla. Thank you for joining.
There's some ongoing questions around open dialogue, which I think Nell and Chris would maybe like a response to, if that is possible. I think, if I'm right in saying, Nell has kind of asked about your experience of limitations in open dialogue. Would that be okay to answer that?
I'm trying to find the question. So the way so this is for a personal account, right? Like how I experience the limitations.
So I understand the question.
Yeah. So the way I have experienced open dialogue in Denmark, in inviting the communities or like people in your network, it didn't take into account that a lot of these relationships, as a minority child, as a child of immigrant, that wasn't healed. We were not in a space where we could actually talk about the next step, because so much was ruptured before that. You know, it didn't take into all the things that I talk about, the context that I have, that I had weren't a part of the open dialogue thing. It was in a very framed setting that this is the way we do things, you know, even though they invited people from the network to talk and everything. I didn't feel like I could address that. I couldn't be a part of it because the first few steps were missing already. Does it make sense?
I think so. I think that's a really thoughtful response, and I think.
And I don't know if I just saw something about the peer supported open dialogue thing. I am so like, I don't know if I said it right or wrong, but I am for peer supported work. Like, I really think that's important, because that's part of building community, because you definitely have some shared experiences and ideas or whatever with peer supported work. You know, they come from the same, some part of the same place that you're coming from in your mind. So yeah, I totally support that.
Are you saying there needed to be more preparation for like your parents or for people to be able to contribute fully
Yes,
to developing perspectives and narratives and
definitely, because you take a group of people, let's say racialized, minoritized people, right, from another part of the world, putting them in a Western setting, but you don't have the same understanding of the terms or ideas that you're going to share here. You know, like therapy is understood in a very different way in my homeland than it is in Denmark or in Western country, or so it's like you're trying to talk with someone who doesn't speak the same language. Does it make sense? So the cultural aspect of where they come from and how they understand things is really important. And the younger the people that you work with, the more important it is, actually. Like grown up can, in some sense, like if my client was a grown up, they would have the sense of agency and they would analyze stuff that they could see, like, okay, so my parents come from this and I come from this, and this is how, you know, you can navigate that. But the younger you are, the more pressure you feel from both the authorities, but as well as your parents and your network, because it's really collapsing the ideas of what they're being discussed, because you're not talking the same language.
how could you improve it?
Wow. I think DEI work, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion work needs to be not just for businesses, but also for people working with other people. So you really need to not just physically make space for people of color and Black people and minority communities. You need to make space for Black ideas, people of color's cultural heritage. You need to make philosophical space to understand that. So it doesn't become a token that now we have so much representation, but actual representation means taking into ideas, you know, and where they come from. So more diversity, but more true diversity, not just diversity for the sake of diversity, not just representation for the sake of representation.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice way to end, I think.
Yeah. Creating more inclusive spaces.
Would Annie or Izzy like to close, or is it, or Jen? Or do you want to have the last word? Sugi?
No, that was great. Just wanted to say thank you. That was a really great talk, really inspiring, and like everyone's saying, really powerful. So yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for having me and inviting me here today. I'm overwhelmed by all the questions and the engagement, actually.
Just want to echo, what Annie said in shorter words. Really, it's been powerful, it's been inspiring, it's been moving, and we're grateful to have you from all the way from Denmark. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Being with us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Huge thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks everyone who joined.
So,
Thank you.
bye.